From the moment he jumped from the plane, Daniel had felt the familiar rush of wind against his face, the sensation that always made him feel weightless and free. Skydiving had never frightened him. It was a place where he felt in control, where the world below seemed distant and harmless. But that confidence shattered in a single heartbeat. His parachute, instead of opening with the reassuring burst he had felt dozens of times before, snapped violently to one side. The lines twisted, locked, and refused to respond. His reserve chute deployed only halfway, flapping uselessly in the wind. In that split second, he knew he was falling too fast, too hard, and with no way to stop it. The ground surged upward, branches blurred beneath him, and he had time for only a single prayer before he crashed with bone-breaking force into the forest below. The impact tore through him like a hammer. Daniel heard the crack before he felt the pain, a crushing internal explosion that stole his breath and flooded his body with fire. Several of his ribs were broken instantly, and each inhale became a battle he was barely winning. He lay sprawled among shattered branches and damp earth, staring up at the swaying canopy that mocked him with its calmness. His radio had been smashed on impact, his gear ruined, and worst of all, he had landed miles away from any planned extraction point. No one knew where he was. No one was coming soon. As the pain radiated through his chest, the forest around him suddenly felt vast, indifferent, and lethal. Daniel realized that surviving the fall was only the beginning of an ordeal he had never trained for. He forced himself onto his elbows, teeth clenched so tightly the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. The forest was dense, shadowed, and eerily quiet, but that silence broke with a single, low growl, so deep and resonant that it vibrated through his broken ribs. Daniel froze. Another growl echoed, this one closer, hungrier. A shape stirred in the trees about 20 meters away. Massive, dark, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of a predator that had already chosen its target. His pulse spiked. Every instinct he had ever known screamed the same truth. A bear was tracking him, and not a curious one, a starving one. Daniel knew the survival rules. Don't run, don't scream, stay calm. But rules didn't mean much when each breath stabbed him from the inside and the predator behind him already smelled his blood. With agonizing slowness, he dragged his body toward a fallen log, each movement sending sharp jolts through his chest. The forest floor felt endless, every inch another reminder of how broken he was. Behind him, the bear's breathing grew louder, heavy, impatient, almost wet with hunger. Twigs snapped. Leaves crunched beneath massive paws. The animal was closing in, following the crimson trail Daniel was unwillingly leaving behind. He knew then that his injury didn't just weaken him, it invited death. He finally reached the fallen log and pulled himself behind it, clinging to the weak illusion of protection it offered. His vision flickered from the pain, but he forced himself to stay conscious. The bear emerged moments later, emaciated, ribs visible beneath its fur, eyes locked with a desperate savagery. It lowered its snout, sniffing the trail Daniel had left, and began advancing with terrible certainty. Hidden only by rotting wood and scattered leaves, Daniel felt his heart pound so violently it hurt. In that moment, one truth consumed him entirely. Surviving the fall had been a miracle. But surviving the creature now hunting him would require something far greater. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, leave your like and comment your city and country so we can welcome you personally. Today's story follows Daniel, a man whose routine training jump turned into one of the most terrifying survival battles ever lived by someone stranded in the wilderness. What was supposed to be a controlled descent became a fall that shattered his ribs and left him helpless in a hostile forest with no communication, no immediate rescue, and no strength to defend himself. Yet the danger of the fall was nothing compared to the horror that awaited him on the ground. A starving bear stalking the scent of his blood through the trees. In this journey, Daniel's faith, resilience, and instinct intertwined in a desperate attempt to stay alive long enough to be found, or to find a miracle he did not expect. Daniel had always been disciplined, physically conditioned, and mentally prepared for emergencies. But no amount of training could have prepared him for this combination of injuries, terrain, and the presence of a predator. His parachute malfunction had set off a chain of events that placed him in the deadliest version of isolation. Injured, alone, and hunted. The forest around him was vast and unforgiving, a labyrinth of shadows and indistinguishable paths that offered no guidance and no mercy. The moment he realized he wasn't just lost, but being tracked, his world shrank to one desperate objective: stay hidden, stay conscious, and stay alive. The bear that stalked Daniel was not acting out of territorial defense. This was an animal driven by starvation, its behavior sharpened by desperation and exhaustion. It didn't simply wander into Daniel's presence, it hunted him with intention. Every movement Daniel made echoed through the forest like an invitation to danger. Every droplet of blood that fell to the leaf-covered ground became a beacon. He understood quickly that he could not outrun, overpower, or even outclimb such a creature. His only chance was to outthink it, despite the pain that clouded his judgment and made every breath feel like a razor tearing through his chest. Yet amid the crushing fear, something deeper rose inside him, a stubborn will to live that refused to be silenced by broken bones or chasing predators. Daniel began searching his surroundings not for comfort, but for opportunity. Fallen logs to hide behind, branches thick enough to shield him, terrain that might confuse the bear's sense of smell. He studied every shift in the wind, every sound in the foliage, every moment of silence that could signal danger creeping closer. His body was failing, but his mind was fighting back, refusing to surrender to the terror closing in on him. As night began to sink into the forest, Daniel faced the brutal truth that the darkness would only amplify every threat around him. The cold would stiffen his injuries, pain would drain his strength, and the bear, desperate and restless, would not abandon its hunt. Still, he clung to a fragile hope that somewhere in this cruel wilderness there might be shelter, help, or even a sign that he wasn't completely forsaken. What he didn't know, as the shadows tightened around him, was that fate was slowly guiding him toward an unexpected sanctuary. A tiny wooden house, hidden deep within the forest, home to an elderly couple whose kindness would one day save his life. But before reaching that refuge, Daniel would have to survive the longest night of his life. Daniel lay still beneath the forest canopy, trying to understand where the fall had left him. His lungs worked unevenly, forcing air past the stabbing agony of broken ribs. The world felt tilted, distant, as if he were watching his own suffering from a place just outside his body. Leaves trembled above him, but the gentle sway of branches only mocked the violence of what had happened. As he stared up through the canopy, he tried to piece together the sequence of seconds that had led him here. The tangled parachute lines, the helpless spinning, the sudden darkness as branches enveloped him. Now the mist of the forest settled around him like a cold blanket. And Daniel realized he had no time to dwell on the past. He needed to move. Something in the quiet of the forest felt wrong, heavy, as if danger was already aware of his presence. He pushed himself upward, and pain radiated from his ribs with such intensity that his vision swam. His breath hitched. He stopped, clenched his fists, and waited for the wave of agony to pass. When he finally managed to sit up, the depth of his injury became undeniable. Each breath sounded shallow and ragged, and each exhale felt like a reminder that something inside him was broken beyond simple endurance. But he forced himself to scan the forest. His gear lay in ruins around him, his radio smashed, his emergency rations scattered, his reserve chute tangled in a cluster of branches. Nothing he saw gave him comfort. The forest was dense, dim, and foreign. Yet the silence was what unsettled him most. It was too complete, too heavy, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Daniel knew he had to get away from the crash site. Injured, bleeding, and alone, he was vulnerable. Predators were drawn to weakness. He understood that from both training and instinct. He pulled himself to his knees, hands trembling, and used the trunk of a large cedar to lean upright. Pain shot through his chest again, but he ignored it. Each step he took felt like a small miracle. As he moved, the oppressive silence around him seemed to thicken. He could hear his own heartbeat, frantic and uneven, echoing inside his head. The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of pine, earth, and something else, something faint, but unsettling. He tried to shake off the feeling, but the forest kept whispering warnings he couldn't decipher. He staggered across the uneven ground, dragging one leg slightly. The fall had bruised more than his ribs. His entire body felt battered, but then he heard it. A soft, deliberate crunch of leaves behind him. He froze, every muscle locking into place. The sound came again, slow, heavy, unmistakably large. His stomach tightened as he slowly turned his head. In the shadows between the trees he saw the faintest movement, a shape shifting. Something breathing, something watching him with the quiet patience of a hunter. Daniel's instincts surged to life. He wasn't alone, and whatever shared the forest with him was tracking his steps. His heart hammered with renewed urgency as he tried to quicken his pace. But every faster step sent pain knifing through his ribs, threatening to collapse him onto the forest floor. Still, he pressed on. The sound behind him grew clearer, soft huffs of warm breath, branches snapping beneath heavy paws. He didn't dare look back this time. He knew he was being followed. His mind raced, trying to remember every survival rule he'd ever learned. But all those rules were designed for someone healthy, someone capable of fighting, climbing, or running. He was none of those things now. He was prey, wounded, slow, and bleeding. Daniel spotted a fallen log ahead, its trunk wide and hollowed with age. It wasn't safety, but it was something. Some form of barrier between him and the threat behind him. He forced himself toward it, each step a battle between instinct and agony. By the time he reached the log, his legs were shaking uncontrollably. He lowered himself behind it, biting down hard to suppress a cry of pain. The forest seemed to pulse around him, every sound amplified. He could hear birds flapping out of the canopy, startled by something approaching. He could hear the faint, rhythmic breathing of the beast behind him, drawing closer and closer. His pulse thundered in his ears. Slowly, he dared to look through a small gap in the log. That was when he saw it clearly for the first time. The bear emerged between the trees as if carved from the shadows themselves. Its fur was unkempt and patchy, ribs showing beneath its skin. The animal looked desperate, gaunt and dangerously thin. Hunger had sharpened its instincts. It wasn't looking for berries or small prey. It was searching for something substantial, something weakened, something like him. The bear lowered its snout toward the ground, sniffing the trail of blood Daniel had involuntarily left behind. Then its head lifted, eyes scanning the forest with a predatory calm that sent cold dread coursing through him. Daniel pressed his back against the log, trying to make himself as small and silent as possible. His breaths came shallow and uneven, the pain forcing him to inhale in sharp, trembling bursts. Each movement felt like it echoed through the forest. He strained to steady himself. He had to stay still. He had to stay unseen. A single sound could draw the bear to him. He shut his eyes tightly, as if darkness could hide him from the danger only feet away. The bear's steps grew louder, slower, more deliberate. It was circling the area, hunting with intention. The bear paused. Daniel could feel its presence even without looking, the weight of its gaze sweeping the forest floor, the soft snuffles as it searched for him. Then the beast exhaled, a low rumbling breath that sent vibrations through the log and into Daniel's bones. He clenched his jaw to keep from gasping. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Seconds became minutes. He waited, motionless, praying for the animal to lose interest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of heavy paws began to move away. Slowly, hesitantly, as if the bear wasn't fully convinced he was gone. Daniel didn't move until the forest fell silent again. He waited even longer, paralyzed by fear and pain. When he finally dared to open his eyes, tears had pooled beneath his lashes. not from weakness, but from the crushing realization of how close he had come to death. He knew the bear would return. It had his scent, it had tasted the air, and it had recognized the promise of a meal. The forest was no longer just a place where he was lost. It had become a battleground, and unless he found shelter or a miracle soon, he wouldn't survive the next encounter. Gathering his strength, he crawled out from behind the log and pushed deeper into the woods, knowing the night would only make everything worse. The forest grew darker as Daniel pushed himself forward, each movement a tug-of-war between instinct and agony. His broken ribs made every breath feel like a blade twisting inside him, yet the terror of staying in one place outweighed the pain of moving. The air smelled of damp moss and fallen leaves, thick with humidity that clung to his skin. Shadows stretched across the forest floor like dark fingers, and every rustle in the distance made him flinch. He couldn't shake the feeling that the bear wasn't gone, not truly. Hunger was a relentless motivator, and the creature had already sensed his weakness. As Daniel staggered deeper into the woods, he realized the forest had begun to swallow the daylight faster than he expected. Daniel found himself following a faint depression in the ground, a barely noticeable trail formed by the passage of animals over years. It offered no promise of safety, but it gave him direction, something his disoriented mind desperately needed. His head throbbed from the fall, and dizziness threatened to pull him into unconsciousness every few minutes. He blinked it away, leaning against trees whenever the world began to tilt. The forest was not just a maze of trees and shadows. It was a living entity with moods, sounds, and secrets. And right now, it seemed to be closing in on him. He felt watched, not just from behind, but from every angle, as if the woods themselves were assessing his chances of survival. As he limped forward, a sudden gust of wind swept through the canopy, bending branches and sending a shiver through the undergrowth. Daniel froze. He felt the shift in the air, sharp, cold, carrying the distinct scent of earth overturned. A warning. Moments later, the sound came. A long, dragging breath. Not far behind him, his heart crawled up his throat. The bear was still there, still following, still hungry. The knowledge struck him with paralyzing force. He turned his head slowly, painfully, scanning the gloom behind him. Though he didn't see the animal yet, he knew it was approaching with the patience of a creature that understood its prey had nowhere to go. Panic threatened to take over, but Daniel forced himself to think. Running was impossible. Fighting was suicidal. He needed to hide again, but this time more wisely. As he searched the forest around him, he spotted a cluster of boulders draped in thick ferns. They formed a small pocket of shadow, barely visible unless someone was looking for it. It wasn't perfect, but it was all he had. Gritting his teeth, he dragged himself toward it, using fallen branches and exposed roots to keep himself upright. Each step sent a shockwave through his ribs, forcing grimaces he couldn't contain. Yet he kept moving, knowing hesitation could mean death. When he reached the boulders, he willed his trembling body into the narrow space between them. The rocks were cold, slick with moss and unwelcoming, but they wrapped him in darkness. A fragile shield he desperately needed. Daniel pressed his body against the rough stone, his breaths shallow, trying to steady himself. For a moment, the forest held its breath with him. Only the distant rustling leaves punctured the silence. Then the sound returned. Closer, heavier, the bear's unmistakable steps. Daniel felt the vibrations through the ground as the animal prowled through the woods, its breathing ragged and hungry. Through a narrow slit between the rocks, Daniel saw the bear emerge. Larger now in the diminishing light, it moved with unsettling determination, its nose low to the ground. Its fur bore a rough, matted look, as if it had spent weeks searching for food and finding little. The animal sniffed the path Daniel had taken, snout brushing the leaves where his blood had dripped earlier. A low growl rolled from its chest, a sound that vibrated through Daniel's bones. Then it looked up, straight ahead, straight toward the boulders. Daniel's blood turned to ice. Had it seen him? Had it sensed him? The bear began walking in his direction. Daniel's hands pressed against the rock instinctively, though he knew the stone offered no real protection if the bear decided to dig him out. His heart hammered uncontrollably, each beat echoing the terror that flooded his veins. The bear advanced, its massive paws crushing twigs and stones beneath its weight. Daniel could see its breath now, a visible puff in the cold air. The animal stopped just a dozen feet from the hiding spot. It tilted its head, sniffing, its eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher what the forest was hiding. Daniel didn't dare breathe. He didn't dare blink. He didn't dare exist. Moments stretched endlessly. The bear circled the area, snout brushing the trunks of trees, scraping bark with its claws. Daniel swallowed the scream that clawed up his throat every time the predator passed close enough for him to hear the slick sound of saliva in its mouth. He wondered how long he could keep this up, how long his body, battered and bleeding, could remain motionless in such suffocating fear. The pain in his ribs grew sharper, begging for relief he couldn't afford. His limbs trembled involuntarily, and he silently prayed the small quiver wouldn't betray him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear paused. Its nostrils flared as it inhaled deeply, tasting the air. Then, with a sudden shift of its head, it turned toward the left, away from the rocks, away from Daniel. It huffed, as if frustrated, and lumbered in that direction. The sound of its heavy steps faded slowly into the distance. Daniel waited, paralyzed, until silence returned to the forest. Even then, he refused to move. The memory of the animal's breath had etched itself into his mind like a permanent scar. When he finally gathered enough courage to crawl out from the shelter of the boulders, the sky above had already begun to swallow the last sliver of daylight. Night was coming, the kind of night that made the forest a crucible of fear. Daniel knew the darkness would embolden predators and magnify every danger. He needed shelter, real shelter, something sturdier than fallen logs and stones. With painful determination, he began moving again. Deeper into the forest, deeper into uncertainty, deeper into the night where the thin line between survival and death would be tested in ways he had never imagined. Night arrived like a tide rising without warning, swallowing the last hints of daylight. As darkness thickened around him, Daniel felt the forest transform. The trees that once stood still now seemed to breathe, their branches creaking like warnings whispered through clenched teeth. Cold air wrapped around him, sharpening every sensation, his pain, his fear, his exhaustion. Each breath was a negotiation with agony. He moved slowly, one hand against a tree, then another. As if the forest itself had become a wall of shifting shadows he was forced to navigate blind. Above him, the moon was smothered by clouds, offering no comfort, no direction, only a dull reminder that he was running out of time. The ground beneath him became uneven, a twisted mess of roots, rocks, and fallen branches that forced him to focus on each placement of his feet. The forest noises grew louder as night settled in. Crickets chirped in chaotic rhythm, owls called from distant perches, and somewhere far off, he thought he heard wolves howling. Daniel tried to reassure himself that wolves rarely approached humans, but then again, nothing about this situation belonged to the normal rules of the wild. Tonight, every creature seemed hungry, restless, and awakened by his scent of blood. His ribs throbbed with a deep, pulsing ache that made it difficult to stay upright. Leaning heavily on a tree trunk, he spat out a thread of blood and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, realizing how frail he had become. Despite the agony, Daniel forced himself forward. Standing in one place felt like begging for death. But as he continued walking, a new sound reached him. Something soft, rhythmic, but too controlled to be an animal moving naturally. He froze. There it was again, a deliberate rustle followed by the faint crack of a branch snapping under weight, not random, not distant, close. His eyes darted through the darkness, searching for movement. His breath quickened, each inhale a knife of pain. The bear, he could feel it. He had escaped twice, but the forest offered no real escape. There was nothing here to mask his scent, nothing to erase the trail he was leaving behind. Daniel turned, pushing himself forward with renewed desperation. His legs trembled with each step, his steps uneven and dragging. His mind screamed at him to hurry, but his battered body obeyed in fragments. He stumbled over a root and nearly collapsed, catching himself on a moss-covered stone. His vision flickered. The world spun for a moment before settling. When he looked back, he couldn't see the bear, but that didn't matter. He didn't need to. The animal's presence was like a pressure in the air behind him, a weight he could almost feel on the back of his neck. He pressed deeper into the forest, lungs burning, ribs throbbing with every jolt. The terrain grew stonier, the trees thinning just enough for patches of moonlight to slip through the canopy. For a brief moment, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. The forest seemed less dense in this direction, maybe leading toward a clearing or a more open path. But the reprieve was short-lived. A sudden guttural growl echoed from behind him, low and resonant. Daniel's blood froze. The bear had found his trail again, and this time the sound was closer than ever. Too close. Driven by instinct, Daniel veered sharply to the right, desperate to confuse the animal. His feet sank into a patch of soft earth, causing him to slip. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his ribs with such violence that he saw stars. For a moment, he couldn't breathe at all. His body seized, his vision clouded. He clawed at the earth, struggling to pull himself to his knees. Every muscle rebelled, every nerve lit with pain. Behind him, branches snapped loudly, massive paws crushing them with no attempt at stealth. The bear wasn't stalking now. It was advancing with confidence, knowing its prey was failing. Daniel managed to stand, swaying dangerously as the forest spun. He staggered forward, desperately scanning the surroundings for anything, rocks, crevices, fallen trees, anything he could use for cover. But the forest here was more open. The trees were spaced widely, the ground more exposed. Panic surged through him. His strength was fading, his breathing ragged and shallow. He placed a hand on his side and felt the warmth of fresh blood seeping through his shirt. That scent alone would guide the beast. Daniel pushed his legs harder, nearly stumbling with every stride. His only hope was to reach thicker cover again. Then, through the trees, Daniel saw something, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A flicker of light, not moonlight, not reflections, a warm, trembling glow, fire. Daniel blinked, unsure if he was hallucinating, but the light remained. It wavered gently, as if coming from behind a window or a doorway. His heart lurched. Could it be a cabin, a campsite, a miracle? Whatever it was human, or at least not part of the forest's merciless cruelty. But even hope had a cost. The light was far, and the bear was close. Daniel forced himself toward the glow, leaning heavily to keep from collapsing. A sharp crack echoed behind him, the unmistakable snapping of a thicker branch. The bear was charging now. Daniel didn't dare look back. Fear lent his legs a surge of adrenaline strong enough to push him into a limping run. But the world blurred around him, and he could feel darkness creeping at the edges of his vision. He whispered a broken prayer, half plea, half surrender, as he pushed himself past the limits of his body. The light grew brighter, closer. Hope pulsed within reach. Just as his legs threatened to give out completely, Daniel saw it clearly through the trees. A small wooden cabin, smoke curling from its chimney, warm light spilling from the window. Civilization, shelter, maybe salvation. He stumbled forward with the last fragments of strength he had left. Behind him, the bear's growl erupted, closer than ever, vibrating through the earth beneath his feet. Daniel's breath caught. He launched himself toward the cabin, knowing the next moments would determine whether he lived or died. With the final shred of willpower in his battered body, he reached the clearing, barely aware that he was collapsing before he even made it to the door. Night closed its fist around the forest, swallowing the last traces of daylight that had kept Daniel anchored to reality. Now, the world was reduced to shadows, cold, and the constant awareness that somewhere out there, a starving bear was still searching for him. The cave that had offered brief shelter became suffocatingly dark. and the absence of light made the space feel even smaller. His broken ribs pulsed with ceaseless torment, sending waves of nausea through him every time he shifted his weight. The silence was oppressive, but it was the kind of silence that never stayed still, one that seemed to listen, breathe, and anticipate movement. Daniel kept his hand pressed against the jagged wall of the cave, grounding himself, reminding his trembling body that he was still alive. He tried to rest, but rest was impossible. Every breath was shallow and ragged, leaving him exhausted just from trying to stay conscious. The cold gnawed at his exposed skin, creeping beneath his clothes like a predator of its own. His mind played tricks on him, pulling him in and out of a haze where he couldn't distinguish reality from fear-induced illusions. Sometimes he thought he heard footsteps, soft, rhythmic, approaching the cave. Other times, he imagined the low rumble of a growl echoing through the stone. But Daniel knew that, imagination or not, the danger wasn't gone. Bears didn't forget wounded prey easily. The more he listened, the more he sensed that the forest was still shifting in response to him, reacting to his presence like it had accepted him as part of its dangerous ecosystem. As the hours dragged on, Daniel realized that staying in the cave was becoming a gamble. If the bear tracked him there, he would be trapped with no exit, no place to run, and no strength to fight. Every survival instinct he had told him that darkness was an advantage. If he could move quietly enough, the night might swallow him just long enough to put more distance between him and the predator. His ribs screamed against the idea. Each attempt to sit up made his vision flash white, and the pain made his entire body tremble uncontrollably. But staying meant dying slowly, helplessly. Leaving meant at least choosing the terms of his struggle. Gathering what little strength he had left, Daniel forced himself toward the cave's entrance. Each crawl was a battle. The ground tore at his palms, and every movement jolted broken bone against bone. When he finally reached the opening, the cold air hit him like a slap, but it also carried something else: space. The night sky above the treetops glittered faintly with distant stars, and though it offered almost no light, it reminded him that the world was bigger than this cave, bigger than his fear. He scanned the forest, listening with every fiber of his being. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. It was the quiet moment he needed. Moving on his hands and knees first, then slowly rising to a hunched walk, Daniel followed the faintest gap between the trees. He chose the direction instinctively, guided more by the uneven rhythm of his heartbeat than any logical reasoning. The forest changed at night. The shadows deepened, the air thickened, and every branch seemed to reach for him like skeletal arms. But Daniel pressed on. His breaths were painful gasps. His mind was foggy. His legs felt like they were carrying someone else's weight. Yet the will to survive kept him staggering forward, one tortured step at a time. At one point, a sound froze him in place. A twig snapped somewhere in the distance, soft, sharp, unmistakable. Daniel's blood ran cold. He pressed his back against a tree, biting down hard on his sleeve to keep himself from crying out in pain. He held his breath until his lungs burned. For a long moment, the forest went silent again. But the damage was done. His heart pounded against his broken ribs, and his weakened senses sharpened just enough to catch another sound, a slow, heavy crunch of leaves, then another, farther away. The bear wasn't close, but it wasn't gone either. It was still searching, still hunting, still waiting for him to collapse. Fear fueled Daniel's steps as he pushed deeper into the forest, letting instinct replace logic. The uneven ground pitched beneath his feet, and several times he stumbled, catching himself on rough bark or cold soil. His breath grew shallow, thinner and colder. The world around him began to pulse and warp, as if the darkness itself were closing around his field of vision. He had to keep moving, he knew that much, but his body was beginning to betray him. At one point he collapsed to his knees, gripping the earth as though it might keep him tethered to consciousness. He whispered a prayer, a desperate plea for strength, for guidance, for anything that could keep him from giving in. Minutes, or maybe hours, Daniel could no longer tell, passed in a torturous blur of crawling, staggering, and clinging to trees to remain upright. But then something shifted in the wind. A scent. A faint, impossible scent. Wood smoke. It drifted between the branches like a promise. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant shelter. Shelter meant people. His legs trembled, and tears filled his eyes. Not from pain, but from a fragile, swelling hope that felt too dangerous to trust. But it was real. He inhaled again. The smoke was faint but unmistakable. Somewhere not far from him, someone was alive. Hope ignited the strength he didn't know he had left. He followed the scent blindly, pushing through branches that scratched his face and tore at his clothes. His body protested every movement with raw agony, but the smoke pulled him forward like a lifeline. The forest began to thin ever so slightly. The ground became more level. The shadows shifted, not because of stars, but because of a dim, distant glow filtering through the trees. Daniel's heart pounded, not in fear this time, but in disbelief. He squinted, trying to separate imagination from reality. There, beyond the thick brush, a faint orange flicker danced against the darkness. When the small wooden cabin finally came into view, a humble structure with a smoking chimney and warm light spilling through the windows, Daniel nearly collapsed. Tears blurred his vision, and his legs buckled beneath him, sending him to the ground. But the sight of that home, fragile and isolated yet radiating safety, filled him with a sense of salvation he had almost forgotten was possible. He wasn't out of danger yet. He still had to reach the front door. But for the first time since the fall, since the pain, since the bear, Daniel realized he had found something stronger than fear, a chance to survive. A chance to be saved. Daniel lay on the cold ground, staring at the small wooden cabin as if it were an apparition conjured by a dying mind. The warm light escaping through the curtains flickered faintly, dancing across the dirt and fallen leaves. For a moment he feared it was a hallucination, some cruel distortion of hope created by exhaustion. But the smell of smoke was real, the glow was real, the shape of the house was real. Summoning every ounce of strength, he pressed his palms into the ground and pushed himself upward. Pain lanced through his ribs with such violence that it stole the breath from his lungs. He staggered, collapsed, then forced himself up again. Step by step, he dragged his broken body toward the front door, each movement a silent testimony to the will to survive. By the time he reached the porch, he was shaking uncontrollably. His vision blurred into streaks of gold and black. He lifted his hand to knock, but lacked the strength to lift his arm high enough. His knuckles brushed the wood lightly, a sound so faint it barely existed. He tried again, forcing more weight onto his trembling arm. This time the knock echoed weakly, then again, slower, fading like his consciousness. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, head hanging forward, breath shallow and ragged. For a moment, all he heard was the wind threading through the trees. Then came footsteps, soft, hesitant, approaching the door from the inside. The wooden door creaked open, and an elderly man with silver hair and concern etched deeply across his face appeared in the doorway. His eyes widened at the sight of Daniel, dirty, bleeding, barely standing. "Meu Deus," the man whispered, instinctively reaching out. Before Daniel could speak, his knees buckled. The old man caught him under the arms, just as an elderly woman rushed to the door, her hands covering her mouth in shock. Together they guided Daniel inside, each movement careful but urgent. The warmth of the house washed over him like a wave, but the sudden change in temperature made his vision lurch, and the world around him started spinning uncontrollably. They laid him onto a small couch near the fireplace. The flames crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the wooden walls, shelves filled with old photographs, and a kettle steaming gently atop the stove. The elderly woman knelt beside Daniel, brushing dirt from his forehead with gentle, trembling hands. "Ella está congelando," she murmured. The man rushed to bring blankets, layering them over Daniel's trembling body. The heat began to seep into his limbs, pulling him back from the edge of shock. But with the warmth came a flood of pain, sharp, searing, overwhelming. He groaned, and the woman immediately pressed a hand to his chest. "Shh! Você está seguro agora, não se preocupe," she whispered. As they assessed his injuries, Daniel mumbled incoherently, trying to explain what had happened. His words tangled together, fragmented by pain and exhaustion. The man placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Filho, calma. Primeiro vamos te estabilizar." He retrieved a small wooden box filled with first aid supplies, bandages, antiseptic, pain tablets, and herbs carefully wrapped in cloth. They worked together, cleaning his wounds with remarkable care. Each touch hurt, but Daniel did not resist. Their hands were warm, their voices were soft. After hours spent running, hiding, and fighting for survival, he finally felt something he had forgotten existed. Safety. The woman prepared warm water and herbs to reduce his fever and pain. A soft aroma filled the room as she pressed a cup to his lips. Daniel drank slowly, each swallow painful but comforting. The heat spread through him, loosening the cold stiffness in his chest. His breathing grew steadier, though the pain remained intense. The man checked his ribs carefully, shaking his head. "Estão quebradas. Mas você teve sorte. A queda podia ter te matado." Daniel nodded faintly, unable to form a full sentence. The man looked at him with grave understanding. "E não foi só a queda, foi?" Daniel's eyes lowered. He didn't need to say it. The man already knew. The woman wrapped his torso tightly with cloth strips, supporting his broken ribs and slowing the movement of bone. When she finished, she sat beside him and placed a hand on his head, as if he were her own son. "Você está seguro. Seja o que for que estava te perseguindo. Não vai entrar nesta casa." The man added extra wood to the fire, reinforcing its glow against the dark windows. Outside, the forest whispered in the cold wind. Daniel listened, expecting at any moment to hear the sound of a bear's growl or heavy steps. But nothing came, only silence, the first peaceful silence he had heard since the accident. Hours passed. Daniel drifted between sleep and consciousness, his mind untangling the last 24 hours of terror. Each time he opened his eyes, he saw the couple nearby, sitting in chairs, watching over him, whispering to each other, making sure he didn't stop breathing. Their dedication felt unreal, almost divine. People so deep in the forest, living so simply, and yet so open-hearted. The man eventually approached and placed a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Amanhã cedo vamos te levar até a estrada. Tem posto de guarda florestal a uns quilômetros daqui. Você vai conseguir ajuda." Daniel swallowed hard, overwhelmed by gratitude. He tried to speak, but the words broke in his throat. The woman understood anyway. "Você foi muito forte, meu filho," she said softly. "Deus ainda não terminou com você." Her voice trembled with emotion. The warmth of the house, the glow of the fire, their kindness, it all washed over him, unraveling the fear that had gripped him for so long. Tears welled in his eyes. Not of pain, but of relief, of survival, of finding sanctuary where he least expected it. The woman gently wiped the tears from his face, whispering, "Descansa agora." Daniel closed his eyes, breathing deeply, without fear, without the shadow of death hanging over him. The fire crackled softly. The couple whispered to each other in the kitchen, preparing something warm for the morning. Outside, the forest remained quiet, as if exhausted by the chase. For the first time since the parachute malfunction, Daniel felt the weight lift from his spirit. He had survived the fall, survived the hunt, survived the night. And now, sheltered in the home of two strangers who treated him like family, he understood something profound. Sometimes survival isn't just about running from danger. It's about being found by grace. And there, in that tiny cabin deep in the wilderness, Daniel finally let sleep take him, knowing he would wake to a new day. Morning arrived slowly, as if the forest itself were recovering from the long and merciless night. When Daniel opened his eyes, the warmth of the cabin still wrapped around him like a protective embrace. The elderly couple greeted him with smiles filled with relief, offering him warm broth and encouraging him to rest until he felt strong enough to move. As daylight filtered through the small windows, illuminating every corner of that humble home, Daniel realized how extraordinary it was that these strangers had taken him in without hesitation. They had given him shelter when death was just steps behind him, had calmed his fears when pain clouded his mind, and had reminded him, simply through kindness, that hope can appear even in the most desolate moments. After eating, the couple helped him walk toward a narrow path leading to the closest forest outpost. Daniel moved slowly, each step heavy, but every breath filled with a renewed sense of purpose. When they reached the small clearing where the dirt path met the ranger trail, the old man placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and looked him in the eyes. "Lembre-se," he said gently. "A vida sempre dá jeito de nos mostrar que ainda vale a pena continuar." The woman smiled softly, her eyes glistening with pride and tenderness. Daniel tried to thank them, but emotion tightened his throat. What words could ever express the depth of gratitude he felt? They had saved him, not just from the bear or the cold, but from the fear that had nearly consumed him. As he watched the couple slowly return to their cabin, Daniel felt as though he were witnessing something sacred. The quiet strength of people who lived far from the world, but carried within them a kindness capable of restoring a stranger's soul. When the forest ranger team finally found him, brought him to safety and treated his injuries, Daniel felt a peace he hadn't known in years. In the days that followed, as he recovered in a small rural clinic, Daniel often thought back to that night in the forest. He remembered the pain, the terror, the bear's relentless pursuit. But above all, he remembered the warmth of the little cabin and the two elderly strangers whose compassion had given him a second chance. That experience left a mark deeper than any injury. It taught him that survival is not just a physical battle, it is a spiritual awakening, a reminder that even in the darkest wilderness, God still places light along the path. Daniel promised himself he would never forget the miracle that found him when he thought he was lost. And as he closed his eyes to rest, he understood one final truth. Sometimes the greatest rescues come not from helicopters or search teams, but from ordinary people moved by extraordinary grace.